The Pharisee is alive and well. He's alive and well. And he's still with us, unfortunately. Every now and again he'll raise his ugly head. I can see him when I walk past the mirror. Every time I walk past the mirror I'll see him. You'll know him when you see him. Because the Pharisee comes out with things like, "I'm glad I'm not that guy." Or, "I don't do what she does." You know, the Pharisee might not have always been like this. At some point in his or her life, he or she might have been convinced they were poor in spirit, that they had nothing to offer God but their own sins, that they could do nothing but throw themselves upon the mercy of God, relying entirely on the blood sacrifice of another in their place. But over time, the Pharisee subtly began putting their confidence not in circumcision, but in their circumstances, what they did or what they didn't do, instead of what God had done for them, or even alongside of what God had done for them. This false confidence then began to snowball into false comparisons between the Pharisee and those around him. And the question is there a Pharisee, is there not a Pharisee? There is. Is there any hope for the Pharisee? Is there? Is there any hope for us when we get like this? There is. That's the good news, there is. But first, where are we in the Bible? Well, Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem. He's determined to get there. He's got an appointment with death on a cross. And on his way, Jesus tells this story of the Pharisee and the tax collector. It's a stirring story. It moves us. It invites us to look into it and see ourselves and the poor state of our hearts. And then it encourages us to stand with the tax collector and to cry out to God for mercy. Come with me to Luke chapter 18, verses 9 to 14. In this story, we're presented with two people, two prayers, and two outcomes. There's a few things similar about these two characters. The first thing that is very similar about them is what we read in verse 10. Two men went up to the temple to pray. That's what's similar. They both go up to the temple to talk to God. Much like us now, who are the temple of the living God, coming together today to talk to God. The second thing that's similar about them is in verse 14, where Jesus says that both of them went home. So they've come together, they've gone home, and eventually after the service, we'll be making our way home, won't we? But the third and most crucial thing, the most pressing thing on these two people's consciences, as we shall soon see, is that both of them want to be right with God. That's why they are there. They want to deal with their conscience. They want to be justified before God. Everything else about them is different. For one, they are on the extreme ends of the social, political, religious scale. Just to get an idea of how different these two men are, it'll be helpful to see them through the eyes of the first listeners of this parable. In those days, if you were a tax collector, you were the embodiment of evil. You were a thief. You collaborated with the Roman regime. That's a bit like getting rich on Nazi bribes by informing on the resistance and then buying one house after another in the surrounding area of those who've been pushed out. Or like when government officials have used our taxpayers' money to host their parties and drink wine and fly in expensive jets and bet on horses at the Cup. If you were a tax collector, you were the embodiment of evil. If you were the tax collector, your parents would have had to lie about your frequent absence in the community and at church services, and say that you were on overseas business. And they did that to protect your dignity so that you can keep face with the community. If people knew you were a tax collector, they would have literally spat on you and cursed the ground you walked on. As far as people were concerned, you belonged with all the lowlifes and scumbags, the drug dealers, the prostitutes, the murderers, and so on. And that's why they all hung out together, because nobody liked those people. You were with those lowlifes and scumbags and drug dealers and prostitutes and murderers and so on. That's a bit of a picture of the tax collector to everyone. He's not the underdog. He's the bad guy. But not so the Pharisee. The Pharisee, on the other hand, he is the model of holiness. He was the pinnacle of religion. When the first listeners thought of a Pharisee, they pictured a churchman. Someone who was always close to the holy things of God, always doing holy things for God, always seen at church, always praying, always paying careful attention to every detail of his life. A holy man of God. Everyone could see just what an exceptionally all-round good guy he was. And the sad thing is that there are many Pharisees in church today. They rock up to church for a show. They come to church to flaunt themselves. If you ask them why they come to church, they say because they like feeling good about themselves. People in church are very good at pretending to be righteous and performing religious duties, very good at comparing themselves with others, putting people down. And I think church folk do this because they seek just self-justification. They're trying to deal with their conscience and they're seeking self-justification. They want to justify their existence. They want to prove to God and others that they are righteous, that they are not so bad, but pretty good. In reality, they want to feel good about themselves because deep down they are trying to avoid their guilt. So in this story, Jesus holds up a mirror. He holds it up in my face, he'll hold it up in your face, and he invites us to take a long, hard look at ourselves. What is our attitude? Is our attitude like what we read in verse 9? To some who were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on everybody else, Jesus told this parable. If that's us, if we're relying in any way on the good things we do for God, or on the good things God has done in our lives, for God to accept us, then our destiny will be like that of the Pharisee. We can go through life trying so hard to be good, to get God to accept us, and get it so wrong and end up in hell. Many people turn to religion, dare I say even a religious form of Christianity, to deal with their guilt. Many. They falsely assume that one day they can take out their good deeds and present them before God as reasons for why God should let them into heaven. They say things like, I go to church. I read my Bible. I was baptised. I give. I don't watch porn. I've never taken another man's wallet or his wife. I've never been divorced. I'm a pastor, a service leader, a Sunday school teacher, a missionary. I volunteer my time and energy to make my community a better place, and I feel good about myself that I do all these things. Such confidence is false confidence. It's false confidence. It sounds just like the false confidence of the Pharisee. Have a look at verses 11 and 12. The Pharisee stood by himself and prayed, God, I thank you that I am not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and give 1/10 of all I get. The Pharisee poses himself. You can tell that he's into performance. He's into performance. No mention of his clothes, but no doubt he's come in one of his best outfits. He takes his stand. You have the priests right up the front, then the men's area, and then behind them the women, and then the rest of the mass, the rest of the people, the unwashed masses. The Pharisee, he takes his stand in the men's area right up the front, right up behind the priests, so that everyone can see how holy they are. And as was his custom when praying, he holds his hand up toward heaven. It's all visible, all public, and he prays. Some translations say prays about himself, or in the footnote of your Bible you might see he prays to himself. Because even though he starts out by saying, God, thank you, it's really a self-centered prayer. I thank you that I am not. I fast, and 1/10 of all I get. In verse 14, Jesus tells us that the Pharisee exalts himself. All his confidence is in his own goodness. He is so full of religious pride. He loves the feeling of superiority. In verse 12, he does far and above what God prescribed in the law. He says he fasts twice a week. Not just once, but twice a week. That's, if I've done the math right, that's 103 times more than God commanded him. God, I give you 103 more fasts. Perhaps if this guy wrote a book called How to Lose Weight in 103 Fasts, he'd be rich, and I'd buy that book. But get this, he gives 1/10 of all he gets. Now, the law required that only the farmers give 1/10 to sustain the Levites and the priests in the temple. Only the farmers were to give 1/10. The Pharisees, who were not themselves farmers, tithed anyway. They tithed their own herbs from their own garden. Imagine for a moment a Pharisee sitting there at the kitchen table with his mint and dill and cutting up 1/10. Look, God, how impressive I am. I even go above and beyond what you command. I do this all for you. There's no humility in him as he comes to pray. Again, Jesus says, this guy exalts himself, verse 14. He's exalting himself. Not only does the Pharisee have false confidence in himself and what he does and does not do, he also makes a false comparison between him and others. He makes a false comparison. Verse 11 again. God, I thank you that I am not like other people. Robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. The self-confident Pharisee is always quick to point out what's wrong with other people. I'm not like other people, he says. And goes on to point out their faults and failures. He has a critical eye. And his assessments of other people, whether right or wrong, is a way to quietly boost his own ego and affirm his goodness. Other people's failings are ways for the Pharisee to feel better about himself. How does the Pharisee deal with his guilt? He puts other people down in thought and word. And the question we have to ask ourselves is, do the Pharisee's shoes fit us? Do we look at others with a critical eye and weigh them up? Jesus warns us that those who exalt themselves in this life will be humbled in the next. It's black and white. The Pharisee judges himself by what he does, and he likes what he sees, and he lists his achievements. But notice, he has no remorse for his sin. There's no love for his fellow neighbour. His self-congratulatory prayer and his put down of others provides his conscience with a smokescreen to avoid his guilt. He offends God with his self-righteous pride. And he offends God with his unloving attitude toward other poor souls. He's going to go away condemned by God on Judgment Day. By contrast, by fabulous, Tony loves that word, fabulous, fab, man, it's fab. By fabulous contrast, the tax collector, look at him. Let's stand with him. Look at him. He's at the temple to do business with God. I don't know why you've come today, but I hope it's to do business with God. That you have an awareness of your own terrible sin. That it troubles your conscience as it does for this man. He recognises who God is and who he is in light of this holy God. Verse 13. But the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Look at what he calls himself in verse 13. A sinner. Literally, the Greek says, the sinner. The sinner. Have mercy on me, the sinner. I am the specimen of what a sinner is. It's me, God. Look at what's in my life, my basement, in my shed, in my heart. I'm the sinner. Friends, the first step to being right with God is to admit something is wrong with you. People who attend AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, know that the first step to being sober is to admit that you have a drinking problem. Likewise, you and I need to admit to God we have a sinning problem. So I ask you, as you're mindful of God, do you admit that you have a sin problem? Do you personally take responsibility for your own thoughts, your words, your actions? In short, do you take responsibility for all that you have in the basement of your life? Not blaming anyone else for your own sin. Not saying, I did this and that because of so and so. No, you sin because that's what you do. I'm a rebel. I'm the sinner. I see what God thinks of me. The tax collector cries out, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Literally, the Greek word for mercy here is propitiation. God, propitiate for me, the sinner. The word propitiation or propitiate is a word we use in theology to talk about God diverting his wrath, his anger, from the sinner to the sacrifice that God himself provides. So as the tax collector looked away from himself, he would have seen the steps in front of him and seen the altar with the blood stains from the blood sacrifice. He would have known that he deserved that death, but that a substitute was provided for his sins. And as he saw that sacrifice, he cried out, God, turn your anger from me. Reconcile yourself to me. Forgive me. God, have mercy on me, a sinner. It is this man, says Jesus, who went home justified before God. He went home that day right with God, not resting on the good things he had done, but depending wholeheartedly on what God had done for him. As I said earlier, Jesus tells this story as he makes his way to Jerusalem. In Luke 9:51, Luke tells us that as the time approached for Jesus to be taken up to heaven, Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem. And in chapter 18, verse 31, he tells his disciples for the third time, he says, Jesus took the 12 aside and told them, we are going up to Jerusalem, and everything that is written by the prophets about the Son of Man will be fulfilled. What is it? What's going to be fulfilled? Well, Jesus says to us, I am the Lamb. I am that sacrifice. See what that tax collector, he saw when he looked away from himself and he saw that blood sacrifice, and he knew that he deserved that death, but that God had provided a sacrifice for him, and he put his trust in that. He says, I am that. I am that sacrifice. I am that lamb. My blood is going to propitiate for you so that God will forgive you. My blood is going to turn away God's anger from you onto me so that he will forgive you, that he will put you in a right relationship with himself. So my question to you and to me is, what will you do with the death of Jesus? Or to put it another way, where is your confidence? The first man put his confidence in his performance. The second man put his confidence in the blood on the altar. Where is yours? It's a very important question. Your destiny depends on you answering this question. And not only does your destiny depend on it, your conscience demands it. Because if you have a conscience like mine, you have to keep answering that conscience of yours. Where is my confidence? What am I relying on? Is my confidence in the death of Jesus? For that's why he came. Do you rest on his blood sacrifice as the only basis for acceptance with God on Judgment Day? If it is, and I hope that it is, God wants you to know that he is delighted with you. You might not feel that way, but feelings are not always a great guide. The truth is that he is delighted with you. If your confidence is in Jesus alone, I want you to say this with me. God is delighted with me because of the obedience of Jesus. God is delighted with me because of the obedience of Jesus. Believe it and rejoice.